it was really cool just because I think especially in youth sports, if you have an extra 20 to 30 minutes a week where your kids are actually playing representatively and using that to improve, it can make a big difference if you just have one or two practices a week.
Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
Alex Sarama, you've been busy. You're back. You're back on the show, which is a good thing. That's a good thing for a kickoff. But you have been busy. You've been busy writing and publishing and doing all things called transforming basketball. Anyway, welcome back.
Thank you, Stu. Always a pleasure to be on one of my favorite podcasts. And yeah, we had a great chat just now, obviously offline. So excited to keep it rolling.
Well, you see, now this is where I've got a bit of a bone to pick with you because, like you say, one of your favorite podcasts, but clearly there's a cue here because, you know, you bring out this fabulous new book and I'm not the first you come to come out. So, you know, you've been everywhere. You've been on everybody else's podcast. You've been on Javier, you know, amazing podcast. We've got to promote him because I love his stuff. But, you know, this is all I'm trying to say is, where am I in the queue?
I think we had it scheduled a while ago, but we both got really busy. So it was the first to be scheduled, but not to be recorded.
You're absolutely right, and of course, as always, it's totally my fault because I think I had to bin you off because I had other pressing matters to deal with. So it's entirely my fault that I didn't make it first. You did give me the opportunity, I declined, so it's all on me. Anyway, how are you and what's been going on?
I'm really well. I'm just in Guildford back home. So wrapping up the season with the London Lions. It was a bit of a crazy year, Stu. I was traveling between Portland on the West Coast, working with the Portland Trailblazers in the NBA and their G League team. And then I was combining that with London Lions, where I was director of methodology. And that was really fun because that was my first time trying out a bunch of the ideas that I'd learned reading, some of Martin Rothwell and colleagues, their papers on it and applying that in a basketball context. And then, of course, I've had transforming basketball too. So been traveling to some cool places, doing, bringing the CLA to basketball coaches in different countries. So definitely been a pretty hectic year combined with the book release as well.
Yeah. And I mean, you're ever present in the social media space. Everywhere I scroll, transforming basketball appears and has cool videos and useful, ideas that you're sharing and all those sorts of things. So clearly that's happening as well. So yes, you have definitely been busy, transatlantically busy. And you have brought out for the video this amazing book called Transforming Basketball. And I'm not just saying it's amazing. I know I have a lot of authors on and I talk about their books being amazing. They generally speaking are, otherwise they don't come on the show. This thing, right? I genuinely think you called it transforming basketball. It could be transforming sport. And because I think it's actually like, regardless of whether you're into basketball or not, there is a lot in here. There's a lot of brilliant, cool ideas in here that are applicable to a load of different contexts, particularly if you're into invasion games. So I've taken some stuff out of here that I can apply into my role as a field hockey coach. But not just that. Like the way you've put it together, I like pictures. So you've got some really great visuals, you've got some great contributions from different people who sort of bring the stuff to life. Just really, and then you've got like QR codes and all that sort of stuff. It's got a genuine feeling of interactivity. In many ways, it's probably one of the first books I've ever seen on the subject matter, which is largely, ecologically dynamics driven, that in my opinion, and it's very difficult with a book, but in my opinion, almost stays true to the ethos of nonlinear pedagogy or whatever, because it's kind of got an interactivity element and you can go further and into different spaces. So kudos, man. This is absolutely unbelievable.
Well, sure, I really appreciate that, especially coming from you. I think it's actually funny because you saw one of the first drafts when we were having coffee in London back in August. And you gave, it was really funny because back then I had terrible chapter names. They were very bland, and it was like, it was like all the the ecological terms, like it would have just put coaches off. And then you gave me the great idea to actually play around with it and make them just more fun. And I think that ended up being one of the better parts of the book because it makes it so much more engaging. So I've got you to thank for that one.
Oh well, I've made a contribution, which is nice to know. Nice to know. Um, and actually you've done a good job with those actually. So talk me through it. Let's just sort of like let's drill into this. There's a lot we can unpack. We don't necessarily I don't want you to go. We're not going to go through it line by line, but there are definitely some things I want to ask you about. There's some areas of interest that like might prompt some further discussion. But just talk me through it. Like, what's the journey been like? Firstly, why did you want to write it? And then secondly, beyond that, like why did you take the approach you took?
Absolutely, Shu. Well, I wrote the book because I wanted it to be the type of resource that selfishly I would have wanted as a coach 5 years ago when I first came across CLA and was trying to learn about the subject area. And I think at the time I found it really challenging because there wasn't a practical application of these ideas in basketball. And there also just wasn't the context of understanding some of the ecological language within my sport. So I was really, I got there in the end, but I wouldn't say it was, and I think it was part of the struggle was good. And I think it was good to go through that process. But I think a lot of coaches, unfortunately, are put off from using these ideas because it's, it's not something, you can't just pick up a CLA and do it immediately, right? It doesn't work like that. But I do think if we can have more resources to support them with their journey, they're at least going to be more motivated to at least try it as opposed to dismissing it straight away. So that was really the motivation of the book. So anyone working in basketball, regardless of the level, could hopefully pick it up and feel like after reading the book, they actually have an idea of where to go next and what it looks like to do this. And I also did the book because I've been seeing so many misunderstandings of the CLA in basketball, and a lot of confusions, a lot of people talking about maybe thinking that they're doing the CLA, but it not being the CLA, or just I think which is more prevalent, coaches just dismissing it straight away without understanding it. So the book was great because it really allowed me to lay everything out in one place.
That's useful actually, and it's an area I wanted to go into first and foremost. I like that, by the way, this idea of a book that would have been the kind of book you would have wanted when you were first starting out with this stuff, which is interesting. Like I liken this book actually to I think one of the other really good pieces that written on this space was Rob Gray's first book, How We Learn to Move. He obviously did the follow-up one, which got way more dense, and I actually, to be honest, found that actually quite challenging. Right, that's more me than him. But the first one was just this brilliant, beautifully simple kind of introduction to the world of ecological dynamics, constraints-led approach, etc., etc. And you've done, I think, something very similar, but obviously through the prism of basketball. You are obviously setting a gauntlet now that I've got to now write transforming field hockey, haven't I? Oh, right, and how am I going to do a job as good as this? Anyway, that's different question. But I like the fact that it is really approachable. You're not dumbing it down in any way. It's not ecological dynamics for dummies. It's definitely not. It's definitely it's honoring the challenge, the complexity, and denseness of the actual thing, but it's still accessible and practical and applicable, I think. And that's really difficult a balance to strike, I think.
Yeah, it was. And I think it was important because I didn't want to dumb it down. And I wanted it's funny, Stu, because a lot of the pushback we get from transforming, it's really silly, but it's coaches thinking that it's our ideas and that we just came up with this. So I'm always very intentional about actually educating coaches on the origins of where this all comes from and all the incredible work that's been done by researchers, the likes of, people like Keith, Duarte, et cetera, because it's I think for basketball coaches, they think that we just woke up one day and decided to do all this, and it's based on obviously all these ideas. There's such a rigorous theoretical framework, and I think that coaches need to know that. And I think if we dumb down the ideas, it kind of we're missing the point because coaches need to. It was like a tweet you shared this week. They need to see what the theoretical foundation is for all of this. And I think that's what happens when you introduce the language and they know what these words mean.
Yeah. And also, a criticism that's been leveled at those of us in, the ecological community is, oh, you use all these big words and terms and it's really off-putting. Well, actually, if you say, well, actually, look, this is an easy way for you to be able to genuinely become more accustomed to these ideas, it demystifies some of it and it then gets over that whole what I call this, I think I tweeted it a theoretical stance, oh, I'm not interested into all that theoretical mumbo jumbo. I just want to get on with doing the job. Well, yeah, I get that. But if we carry on like that, then coaching's never really going to progress, is it? We're always just going to be based on folk pedagogies.
That's it. And on the language too, Stuart, I don't think it is that challenging. Like for context, in the London Lions, so I had an awesome team of 4 coaches that I was working with predominantly. And they came in with, I'd say a very basic knowledge of CLA. They weren't kind of doing it. But the level they're at now is incredible. And I'm going to practices learning from them and seeing how they're delivering. And just from them, making an effort to learn some of the language, within a couple of months, we were able to use terms like an affordance in the context of creating player development plans for our players. And it just changed everything when we actually had this shared language and shared lens to view things. It was far more efficient because a coach could use the terminology and we'd all be on the same page and understand what it meant. And I think that was really cool because that was the first time I'd actually been in that program where it's not just myself using the language, but we've actually got the whole staff understanding it, using it, knowing how to apply it. And I think it made what we were doing on the court so much better because of that.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So it just goes to show, doesn't it? If you get enough of an opportunity to begin to come to terms, it's like any field, isn't it? Something's new, it's got different kind of terms, it's got different language and all those sorts of things. And I think it's just too easy to dismiss that stuff. Weirdly, I find it the other way around. I love sort of oh, what's that? Affordance or functional variability. What the hell's that? And like working it out and exploring it and then working out then how it might be applicable. Like that's just kind of the way I'm built. By the way, before we jump back into this, you said something in your intro. Director of methodology. What the hell is that? A, it sounds cool, but B, like what was it involving? What did you do?
Yeah, it was a cool title. So the idea was I was inspired by a lot of kind of Martin's papers on this. The idea was that it would be a multi-year plan. Unfortunately, we ended up only with 1 year because our owners, 777, got in problems trying to buy Everton Football Club. But the idea was the first year to basically implement a one club philosophy within the academy. So I tried some really unique ideas here, Stu, where yes, we had our age group coaches, but I also mixed the coaches a lot so that they weren't just coaching their team. Because I see this a lot in youth sports where you have the silos within the club because the coaches only work with their age group. And you naturally become protective of your players, even though you're in one club. So we tried some really unique ideas where the idea was we'd create this functioning department to essentially view basketball performance through an ecological lens and have basically remove silos within the organization. So that started with us kind of designing together our principles of play and having those implemented within each age group. So the idea is you could go into any Lions practice and you would have seen shared language, principles of play, coaches coaching in a similar way while still being their own unique selves. And I think that's one of the greatest tools of the CLA. So it was essentially, I was running a lot of coach development, coach workshops throughout the year, kind of going into the practices, seeing how the coaches were coaching, viewing their practice plans each week. So it was amazing just to see kind of what we achieved when the coaches were more focused on the overall club as opposed to just their team. And the goals the second year, I think it would have been more of a functioning department methodology where we would have added like a strength coach, a physio, and then we would have all been meeting regularly and basically applying a CLA to everything we were doing in every part of basketball, from video to physio to in the weight room. So that was the goal by year two, which unfortunately we didn't get to, but it's been good because I've been thinking about what this would look like in an NBA setting. So I've been really able to learn kind of how this could be applied. And I think that will happen over the next few years where an NBA team will go down this route.
Amazing. I love. I think I've heard Martin Rothwell and Keith Davids talk about this idea of director of methodology, department of methodology before, and but like when you actually hear it in practice and being applied, and then some other people would call it like a coach development role, but it's more than that, really. It's actually trying to say like embed a kind of philosophy and an ethos throughout an organization. So it, like you say, it isn't dependent on whatever the approach or philosophy of each individual coach is, because that's a real problem in organizations. And whether it's a voluntary organization, like a community sports club like I run, or it's a professional enterprise, too much of it, the sort of it is kind of at the mercy of whichever practitioner comes in and their own ideas, and so you never really got an identity. Whereas
That's
I think
exactly
the
it.
most successful clubs, even those with the ones without necessarily the resources, are the ones that have got a very, very clear identity and a sense and a philosophical roots to what they're trying to do, and then they hire coaches in accordance with those ideas.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think it's all about how you have those principles of play developed and support the coaches to do it. And I think that's what a lot of coaches ask me. We've got volunteer coaches. How can we go about helping them understand how to implement principles of play and use the CLA? And I think that's where this methodology role can be really, really useful. And I think it's quite ironic too, Stu, because from what I've seen, the higher you go in basketball, the more entrenched these silos become, because obviously there's more resources, more positions, more people involved, and it's quite incredible even seeing in an NBA setting how it's not functioning like it should be, because it's just so siloed, and especially as things like sports science have become more prevalent. I think that only increases the fragmentation we see. So I think especially at the professional levels of basketball, finding ways to create this department, I think it's one of the greatest competitive advantages there is. And I think too, Stu, that you shift towards CLA through becoming more specific. Because I'll say this, I think the biggest rate limit in professional sports is especially in America, it's a lot of coaches are so general and generalistic and vague. And I think if you started to be more specific and you introduce terms like rate limiters, and you use the department methodology to try and solve these team-wide or player individual rate limiters, the factors preventing them from being more skillful. Well, naturally, I think the only way you can do that is CLA, because if the rate limiters are identified well, then they're going to be so specific that you have to create a really specific environment to solve them, to allow the players to solve them. And that's where if you're just doing a traditional drill, it's not going to cut it. So, and what I was thinking, and I presented to a few NBA teams this offseason about, potentially going down this route. And I think it's a great way to move practitioners towards CLA in a more ecological way, because through all the interventions, meetings you're having, the CLA is often the only way that you can solve some of the things that you're bringing up. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's actually your point about being very specific is interesting, and I actually think this is one of the pushbacks sometimes you get is when you work in this way, you do have to be very precise about what it is that you're trying to achieve. so that you can design the learning experiences for the athletes and or co-design them with, coaches. And so people think that, like in the past, people think it's just playing games, for example. It's way more precise than that, right? And
Like,
and but a lot of coaches, I think, they don't like it because it exposes a lack of knowledge, because they've been able to get away with generalities before, and a lack of knowledge because, like, no one questioned them. They were the coach and they had the ideas and they were there. And of course, it's going to be even more acute. Your point about the silos increasing the further up the pathway you go. I've experienced this myself in the consulting stuff I've done with various pro sports teams. Like, there's more to lose, isn't there? They've spent all this time getting there, and then for someone to come along and begin to expose the flaws in their knowledge, whoa, you're not doing that. That might mean I've got to leave here. Now, it's weird because you've then got to work culturally, haven't you, to say, actually, one of the hallmarks of really high quality practitioners is they wear their knowledge very lightly, and their expertise is such that they understand that they've got a lot more to learn, and therefore they need to be open to ideas, open to working in a multidisciplinary way. And if they're not, then you have to question whether they should be there or whether they should be there, and then it becomes a really interesting challenge. And it's really so many times I've seen that.
it's so true. And the whole job preservation thing, I think it's one of the biggest reasons there's so much path dependency in basketball and sports as a whole. And I was thinking about this in relation to forms of life, Stu, and I was thinking, I've never cared about it because it's like I've had nothing to lose anyway. I mean, I'm a basketball coach from England, trying to infiltrate the NBA. So I've never cared about like losing a job or anything like that. And I think that good coaching comes when you're actually pushing the boundaries, being creative, taking some actual risks in terms of, like, in Portland, I would frequently try new stuff, which I had never done before, in front of the general manager watching a practice, right? I didn't care because I was confident because obviously I've used this for a few years now in terms of CLA, but I knew that the good stuff would come just from trying things out, and the players would appreciate it because it's, especially in the NBA, it's so monotonous. Every day is almost the same. Practice, the routine, all of that. So when they're actually getting to do something different, I really think it brightens up their day. But a lot of coaches they wouldn't be willing to do that in that setting because they're so, and I understand why, they're so concerned about losing their job. So it's a tough one to get over.
Yeah, but weirdly, like, the lack of a willingness to embrace new ideas is a surefire way to bring about what they're trying to avoid. There's a sort of the irony that's sort of linked to that. Just as a matter of interest with Portland, you probably can't say too much, but like, that's an interesting organization that's firstly, kind of adopting, some of your ideas and wanting you to be involved in what they're doing. Clearly, there's an appetite within the organization to sort of break some boundaries and do things differently.
Defo. So I mean, I was really grateful was the front office. So it was kind of, I've had a contact there, Sergio Oliva, who he's from Catalonia originally, and he was actually coaching youth basketball in Catalonia before many years ago. He started in the NBA in an analytics role and then kind of worked his way up. He was an assistant coach in at the Utah Jazz too before the Portland role. But he's been aware of CLA for years, actually, Stu, because it's funny, I didn't know this, but in Catalonia and coach education in the Basketball Federation, they're actually educating coaches on CLA, which is incredible. But because obviously there's a language barrier, so I never knew that there was actually such good work being done there until Sergi kind of told me and introduced me to some of the people there. So he's been really interested in this, and then fortunately the GM Joe was really, really interested to explore this. The G League team was a perfect setting, I think, to try it out because it's the development team of the NBA team. So, what have you got to lose? And it was a great year because I think I really got to figure out what this looks like at that level and what the players like, what they respond to well. And I'll give you one example. One of the highlights of the year was we were playing the G League team, the Golden State Warriors, away. And there's this, it's a form of life. Every team in basketball warms up before the tip off with layup lines. Okay. They do dunks, all of this stuff. It's 2 lines, they go. And I walked out and I saw 4 of the players who I was working with very extensively instead doing a 2-on-1 small-sided game on one half of the court while the rest of the team did the layup lines. And I walked out with the other coaches because, the national anthem was about to play. And they called me over and they said, Alex, it's your drill. It's your drill. And I was like, that was one of the most rewarding moments of my coaching career because it's a lot of people are very concerned about what NBA players would think about this. And they use that as a rationale for not going down this route. But I can honestly say that I think any player loves it because they realize that it's more specific and it's going to help them get better. And what player wouldn't want to participate in that?
Yes, you just said something there that is so true, and I experience it in, more lower levels of sport and all forms. The amount of times I've gone to a festival or a tournament with a group of kids, and I see these, I see 8-year-olds doing what if you must have come across the farmyard warm up. Have you come
I
across that?
haven't. No, I haven't.
So it's kind of a way of doing like dynamics, right? But so basically you do like an action where you kind of take a step and you bend down and you brush your hands along the floor. It's kind of like a dynamic hamstring stretch, right?
Okay.
But it's called shoeing the chickens, right? That's shoeing the chickens. And then there's another one where you're raising your leg up in the air. We call that kicking the donkey. And then you do like an adductor stretch, which is, closing the gate and opening the gate. So it's called the farmyard warm up, right? Because you close the gate, you've opened the gate, you shoe the chickens, you kick the donkey and all this sort of stuff, right? So I see everybody doing that now. It's just become like the formula. Everything's so formulaic, right? And 8-year-olds are doing this, right, before a festival. So tell me in what walk of life, right? Like, when kids are at school and they go out for
Yeah.
lunch break or whatever and they're playing, they don't warm up to do it, right? And I don't see a plethora of injuries, like kids coming back in with like overuse injuries or like, they've like sprung a hamstring. They don't. It's just totally unnecessary, but it's expected. It goes back to that point, like athletes and coaches do things that they think are expected,
Yes.
not the things that they think will be effective. It's the weirdest thing.
It really is. And it links back to what we were talking about with the London Lions role. We actually, together as a coaching staff, we designed like a completely different approach to warm-ups where basically, as you say, the players came out from all our teams in the academy and they would just be doing small-sided games for the whole 20 to 30-minute warm-up. But we would tweak the constraints based on what we were expecting the opponent to do or see. So, for instance, if we knew that they used one type of defense, well, we would just replicate that defense in the small-sided games by changing the constraints. It's really simple. And it was really cool just because I think especially in youth sports, if you have an extra 20 to 30 minutes a week where your kids are actually playing representatively and using that to improve, it can make a big difference if you just have 1 or 2 practices a week.
Yeah, totally. Totally. And given that warm up is supposed to be preparation for competition, it's not just a physical act. In order to physically prepare for competition mindlessly, if we can connect together the physical preparation with the mindful preparation around the kinds of experiences that people, so we're psychologically ready, we're emotionally ready, we've got the level of arousal and awareness needed for the competition. But often warm up is just a purely physical act, and I think it's so impoverished as a result.
It is true. And I can talk like in the NBA G League setting, I would, like you said, it's getting the players ready for the affordance landscapes that they're going to be immersed in when the game goes off. So what I do is in the NBA, each player often comes out for their pregame and they get a 10-minute warm up with the coaches. And it's often a dance rehearsal where they're just doing like spot shooting, doing these moves, blah, blah, blah. And it's actually quite comical when you look at it and you understand Eco D. So I got some of the strangest looks this year from opposing staffs when they'd look down our end and see what we were doing with the warm-ups. And often, obviously, what we do is we'd put 2 players together. So instead of just being 2 players out working one-to-one with a coach doing 2 things, try and make them interact. And then we'd have the coaches would be playing live defense, going fully live, and would be linking it to the principles of play that we had for our team and maybe the scout report. So something I liked doing was was just replicating, all right, you're guarding these players today. I want to put you in random situations where you got to use some of the coverages, the defensive coverages that that the coach has emphasized on the scout report. So I basically used it to reinforce the knowledge about that, because there's a lot of knowledge about in the NBA, an enormous amount of video, talk, shoot arounds, too much, right? But at least that's where, using the CLA, we can at least develop that knowledge of where they're applying all the things that are being thrown at them, because that's where you see when they're actually doing these things in small-sided games, the mistakes are huge because they're forgetting they forget the scout because there's just so much information being given. And it's just such a good competitive advantage where you can reinforce and bridge those things together.
Nice. So we went from, I asked you a question about retro methodology. We ended up talking about warm-ups. Let's reverse back out the rabbit hole, or the side alley that we went down. Let's come back to this book. So we started to talk about this, and it's a little bit of a theme of what we've been talking about. But so the first chapter, I'm not going to be linear with this, but the first chapter, which I was attracted to straight away, was this notion of eclipsing the status quo. You described it as an industry built on myths and misnomers, which is really interesting. So, I mean, let's just unpack a few of those, because I think it's an interesting place to start, to basically say, there are some culturally resilient practices, beliefs, that are underpinning those practices and all those sorts of things that we need to challenge in order to present the alternative paradigm. So fire away, go wherever you want.
Absolutely, Shu. So I think it's funny because when I was writing the book, I've been fortunate where I've traveled quite a bit. I had this role about 6 years ago. I was working for the NBA league office. So that's when I did a lot of traveling, and I was seeing basketball in a lot of different places, from Kazakhstan to South Africa to the States to basically every country in Europe. And, despite obviously all the different cultures and the forms of life in each place, I saw the same kind of things frequently occurring on the court in terms of how coaches coach, the drills they use, and even like how they approach basketball. We spoke about it on the last podcast I did when we were speaking more about applying these ideas to offense and defense and like tactics and how you coach that. So, and it's really funny because also what you see a lot of is coaches pointing, you see this in every sport, but especially in Europe, they point to countries like Spain or Serbia or Lithuania, where there's a lot of the dominant approach, where it's drilling, technique. And they often point to those countries as why the dominant approach is justified. And it's really interesting because I think that chapter allowed me to start breaking down some of those barriers and actually going deeper into why the status quo exists and having an awareness of it. Because I think coaches, if they understand the limitations and why they're biased in their thinking, they might start coaching a little differently if these things are just being questioned. So that was kind of the essence of that chapter. And I took Mark O'Sullivan had a great blog a few years ago on path dependency. So I kind of took that idea and ran with it, looking at what path dependency is, aka the idea of doing things in sports which don't really make much sense when there are better evidence-informed alternatives. So I really kind of came up with it wasn't by all means exhaustive, but some of the most prevalent path-dependent ideas in basketball which apply to sports as a whole. And I just tried to break them down and use that as a foundation for then introducing kind of the very beginnings of EcoD in the next chapter.
So one of the ones you take a shot at, which I like, is two-ball dribbling. I still don't get that.
It's funny, and I equate this to when you see football players juggling, where you see like a football performer doing all those freestyle tricks. And it was actually funny because I think it was about 6 months ago, a video did the rounds on social media where they took one of the best football freestylers and they made him play a one-on-one against a professional football player. And I'm sure you can imagine the result. He couldn't get past the defender one time. And I think that's the exact equivalent of a two-ball dribbling. And you see it in every single NBA practice gym, pretty much. You see it in pre-game warm-ups. And it's such a, like you said, it's a culturally resilient myth that we've got to try and overcome. And like something we were doing in Portland was literally just playing dribble tag straight away, or having the guys go playing against the guided defender, where I just moved my body in different ways and they had to find a different way to get past me. And it's the alternatives are so simple.
Why do you think something like two ball dribbling emerged? What's the rationale? Does anyone have a rationale? Um, or is it just something that has become cool and everyone does it?
Yeah, that's it. It's the myth of fundamentals, and you spoke about it on the last Dog Walk Diaries podcast when the first series where you're breaking down the alternative to coach development, talking about the failed system that it is. And you spoke about the influence of things like Taylorism. And it's funny, Stu, I actually studied Taylorism at university because I did history. It was really funny. I spent 6 months really going deep into it. So that's why actually it really resonated with me when I realized how those ideas had been applied in a sports setting. And I think it's especially in North America, but elsewhere, I'd say even more so in North America, there's kind of the idea of being a fundamentalist coach. It's kind of seen like you're like protecting the last, like it's a dying breed, you know. So I'd say coaches, especially at the high school level, they take even more pride in it because other things are going on, like AU basketball skills trainers, etc. So the idea of being a fundamentalist coach, it's kind of synonymous with supposedly being effective in basketball. And obviously, one of those basketball fundamentals is two ball dribbling. So it's a lot of reasons that all come together.
Wow. Um, something else that I thought was interesting as well is that you unpack the difference between block constant practice and blocked variable practice. So like people often talk about block practice and they think that like the difference there's block practice and there's random practice and they're the two things that you talk about. But actually there's not. There's, like you say, there is blocked variable practice because block practice isn't necessarily bad. It's not necessarily frowned upon. It's just more that's just more a kind of practice paradigm. Within that, you can include variability, and therefore you can enrich it. But anyway, just unpick that a little bit more
Exactly.
because I've had quite a few
Exactly.
debates with people on this one.
So that was an interesting one. That was actually a tough one to write, Stu, because I wanted to get across that I don't think I think a lot of coaches, when they first look at Skillac ideas, they talk about block versus random. Obviously, it comes from IP. So I wanted to say that, you know, these ideas are less relevant when we get to discovering an ecological approach. I think that's the exact kind of phrasing I used. But I still felt I had to describe it to obviously show how the Skillac kind of community has evolved over the last 60 years. But then also because, like you said, I would have no problem in essence doing a blocked variable drill where maybe we're just doing a shooting activity through the CLA where it is just shooting they're doing, but there's a lot of inherent variability. There's an opponent closing out from different places. The shooter is changing range and location every time. That is a great activity. And obviously, the problem is what we see predominantly with the dominant approach in basketball would be the blocked constant, where they're shooting, but they're doing it from the same range, the same location, receiving the ball from the exact same place every time, and there's no opponent. So obviously, that's a big difference.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see that as well. Like it was interesting that it was in there, and people would immediately go, "Oh, hang on a second," but actually, it's the notion of random versus blocked is a little bit of a false dichotomy, really, because we're not really advocating for kind of one or the other. Yes, there's evidence to suggest that random practice, while in the task doesn't necessarily show improved performance, has longer term benefits. And I think that is an underpinning finding in the research that leads you then down the discussion around how do we design experiences that have appropriate levels of randomness to lead to longer term retention of these ideas, even if during the practice we don't necessarily see the improvement within that short time frame. And I think that's a problem a lot of people face is this sort of driver. And again, the more I think about it, the more I think about how the environmental drivers, like these cultural drivers, lead to certain practice. So, for example, the need for coaches to feel as if they've seen tangible improvement, and for that matter, the athletes, within the short time frame of the session in order for the session to be evaluated as effective, versus the fact that the session should be full of struggle and challenge and difficulty because we're working towards a longer term outcome, which is that we're going to begin to start to embed some ideas into the way we operate and the way we work. And that is going to take some time and is going to, by definition, require messiness. That's just so those two constructs are so diametrically opposed. It's really weird, isn't it?
It is, and I think that's why coaches. I think actually a lot of basketball coaches were surprised because they thought that blocked versus random was like a CLA thing. So that's also why I wanted to really highlight the differences. But I think it and like you said, the limitation on what I think the example I used in the book was, well, you could be doing a lot of coaches in basketball they call it 5-on-0 script, where they're repeating an offensive play 5-on-0. And that is technically random practice because you're moving, you're dribbling, you're passing, you're shooting. So, and that's the limitation because obviously with an ecological approach, we'd see no value to a drill like that. But I think why it is useful in highlighting is because, and I think again this comes from the book. What I said was that in the NBA, if you were to see an NBA practice, the average NBA practice, more than 90% of the activities would be blocked constant activities. So I think why the term is useful is because at least it shows what a huge disconnect there is in terms of, some of the first contextual interference effect research was what batting. It was 60 years ago, maybe 70. And yet in the present day, most of what we're seeing at the highest level of our sport it's basically 70 years behind. So it's quite a shocking statistic when you think about it. And that's actually when I'm speaking to kind of front offices, that's often something I say. And then it's, obviously the ecological approach, it goes so much deeper. You can apply it to everything in an organization. But I think it's good just to have a base awareness of it so we can also see how we've evolved, the skill act community has evolved.
It feels to me like, we're so as humans, we're so socially constrained by some of these ideas that if we could free ourselves from them, who knows what possibilities exist for us. It's like, I mean, that's a shocking stat. 90%. Did you say it was 90% was block constant practice, or was it a
Yeah.
mix of block constant and block
I'd say
variable?
blocked constant, Stu, which is
90%. Is that
more,
in season or out of season as well?
Pre-season there's more playing because it's training camps, but this is the thing. It's like if you're going to take the risk with going live with players on, huge salaries where if they get injured, it's a problem. You might as well. I don't think it's a risk personally, but you got to do it in the right dosages, and you've got to make sure that every second is efficient and counts. So if you're just going live to do random drills, what's the point of doing it, right? And that's often what we see when the guys do go live at that level. It's not in very, very specifically created, constrained activities where the learning value is going to be optimal. It's just kind of a random free for all.
So what you're saying when you talk about this going live construct is, and it's why I asked the question about during the season, because obviously during the season the games come thick and fast, don't they?
Yes.
And so the rationale is that the practice isn't so much designed around taking on new ideas or embedding new technical constructs or pairing for the next match against the next team, knowing the kinds of things that they do. It's more you're just sort of it's almost just getting hands on the balls and staying moving, staying loose. Maybe working on some, maybe you've had a poor shooting performance the night before, you're trying to build some confidence, these sorts of things. And so it's really based on, it's almost like a maintenance rationale,
That's
which
it.
again has never really made much sense to me because
No,
so
makes
what
no.
you're saying here though is it's not any better to go, right, we're going more random, more live, if you're just doing that for the sake of it. But if you're
Yes,
doing it with a purpose, coming back to your earlier point about specificity, then it has a real applicability and rationale. And therefore, not only is it justified, it becomes essential.
that's it, Stu. And I think it's you're fortunate too, and I'm not going to reveal all the secrets, but I can say this: in the NBA, you have a lot of coaches there, a lot of personnel, and a lot of former players, which is awesome. You need that on a staff. And what that means is that you can actually use the CLA really well because you've got all these great defenders and teammates available who can actually create very specific environments for the players. But obviously, to do that, you need a coach leading it who has an awareness of this. And that's the thing because it's we have so few candidates right now in the basketball world who could actually do that. And it's that's why I'm hoping that transforming will lead to more of those candidates emerging. But it's the potential is easy. And I honestly don't think that you need to even go live player versus player at all in an NBA setting because you've got all these great coaches available who can play defense. So as long as you're using them in the right way, and imagine, like you said, imagine if for every season, instead of having maintenance practices, like you said, where the players aren't getting better, imagine if they actually get better every practice, every pregame. Imagine the difference in 1 year. Imagine the difference in 2 seasons, 3 seasons. Well, sure enough, that's a huge competitive advantage that you are accessing.
Yeah. Like, yeah, staggering, really. Wow. Um, so, by the way, you mentioned earlier on the travails of the owners of the London Lions and their attempted purchase of Everton. Have you ever heard the old joke about what's the best way to become a millionaire?
I have not.
It's to be a billionaire and then to buy a professional football club.
That's funny. I see it now.
Um, right, let's just move on a little bit. I mean, we could talk about myths and theories forever and ever and ever, but one of the other chapters that caught my eye and I delved straight into in my non-linear reading approach, um, you talked about this notion, and you've talked about it already, which is this notion of principles of play, and sort of linking the principles of play to a specific theoretical framework. So there are principles of play for the sport itself, but often organizations have a particular approach within the framework of the principles of play, and that's how you become really specific. Now,
Yes.
interestingly, quite a lot of organizations don't necessarily. They sort of do in an implicit way, i.e., the coach has a framework of how they want the team to operate and work. It's very rarely organizationally driven. So you can't do preparatory work with the developing athlete to equip them then for taking the steps into the first team, which seems a bit illogical, but it often happens. But so anyway, you're talking about this process of going through how you take principles of play, apply them into sort of your tactical application, and then design your practices accordingly. Now it's quite complex, but actually talk me through that really and the ideas
Yeah,
underpinning that.
absolutely. So I think you've got these universal principles of play, things which every team needs, which would be something like shot spectrum in terms of the shots that you prioritize trying to take. Dominoes, I call that's in any team sport, simply playing with an advantage. Dominoes. So promotes the idea of keeping the advantage, converting it till we get a great shot. Um, so those would be kind of the top principles of play, but then the specificity of what you do within that is completely subjective to the players you have. So, for instance, on dominoes, right? Maybe you have a team where they don't shoot 3 pointers as well. So you have to emphasize instead of spacing more outside the arc, maybe to end the dominoes, you emphasize more cutting, right? So I think it's really important that as coaches, yes, you have principles of play and they need to be as specific as possible, but they shouldn't just be the exact same for every single team you work with because they need to be. I think you should actually involve your players in co-design And it could be as simple as asking them what they like, what they feel like they're efficient at. But then critically, players are obviously, as we know, forms of life and everything. Players are going to be very different and perform differently based on where you are, where you're coaching, their age. So I think it's important to know what part of your principles of play are flexible and how you may adapt them based on the players you're working with and the opponents in the league versus some things which will be more fixed and universal, like something like I call it floor is lava, Stu. And I think this you could apply this in any invasion sport where what will happen when you play with kids for the first time in any sports side of games, the spacing's really poor. They all kind of crowd around the ball and they stand inside the 3-point line. So what that does is it removes attractive affordances to drive and finish and to get efficient shots because all the space is taken up. So all we say is it's a constraint where the floor is lava. You cannot catch the ball inside the mid-range unless you're doing a ghost cut, which is we call them catchy terms because the kids like it, which is just a cut off the ball. That's all it is. So naturally, if you apply this in any small-sided game, you see that the spacing becomes really great. And we're not telling them where to stand. And the spacing might be different every time in terms of the positions they fill, but no one's going to be standing in the lava. So that would be an example to me of a universal principle of play, which would be the same with any team I coach. But then, like I said with the dominoes example, what we actually do when we have that advantage, how we're educating the attention of our team, well, that is going to change based on who we have. Did I make good sense of that?
No, it suggests to me that you're utilizing the notion of principles of play and then designing practice activities in order to establish shared affordances.
Yes, that's exactly it. And I think this is the really fun part because the principles of play you use, the possibilities are endless, really. So a key part of it too is just I simplify everything. So it's simply the aim of the offense in any team sport is to disorganize the defense, create an advantage, to basically be in dominoes as often as possible. So then if we reverse engineer backwards from that, it's just a case of, all right, how can we get to dominoes in an efficient way? And unfortunately, this is where the game models creep into the equation. And in basketball, we see a lot of this pass and cut offense, where it's pass and move, pass and move. And I've seen this in other sports too, Stu, where coaches say to players, after you pass, you must move. And again, this links back to everything we've spoken about today. Like, is that really necessary? Is it really effective? And again, it's become this own form of life within basketball where coaches believe if you're not teaching this kind of very scripted motion, you're not an effective youth coach. But ironically, doing this scripted pattern, this pass and cut offense where you pass, move, well, you're not actually attuning players to affordances. You're just getting them to repeat your pattern that you've imposed on them. So it's trying to get coaches in all these sports away from these motion offenses because it exists in every sport and just getting them to coach through concepts. I call it conceptual offense. And I think you could apply this to anything. It's where it's all principles, it's shared affordances. And yes, you might emphasize certain things, but there's enormous flexibility for how they're achieved and done.
And just to unpack a bit of that, I like this notion of floor is lava around this idea of spacing. So one of the things that you've touched on there is you come up with these terms, because like the kids hook onto them. But actually, there's a real specific purpose to that, and you refer to this in the book, which is in order to establish a conceptual offense, what you need to do is to create a shared language where you have terms that come to mean things so that in our verbal communication, because not everything can be done purely through perceptual, albeit it's interesting when players play in silence, how things change. It's really fascinating. But
Well, it's
anyway,
the
I've
best
done that.
constraint, especially with under 12s, because they all yelling ball, ball, ball. And we actually
Yeah,
used that as a constraint consistently. It was amazing. And we applied it to the games. And that's
yeah.
your tactical interventions. Sorry, I'm going off track.
No. It's good. I mean, I do the same. I mean, I do operate sometimes get to operate in silence, but largely as a constraint, so that firstly, they can't just go, yeah, or, I mean, that is genuinely in field hockey. That's all they say. Yes, like that means anything. But actually to start to explore how their physical signals can determine or convey an intention on a deliverer of the ball, as a receiver, about where I would like to receive the ball or where I'm moving or the signals that you can give off. And then what that does is create the visual connections naturally,
Yeah.
which need to happen because the amount of players who play without visual connection. So like we often do just a kind of very simple, relatively unopposed warm-up activity, but it's a variable warm-up activity where we're we're connecting with each other, and the amount of players who will pass the ball to somebody and that person was not expecting the ball to come.
Yes.
Like, why would
Yeah.
you have delivered that if you haven't had the either the verbal or the visual connection with another human being as to not just do they even want the ball in the first place, are they paying attention to you, but how do they want the ball? So getting specific. How do we want the ball? Where do you want the ball? How do you want the ball? And
Yeah.
then we deliver the ball to them rather than I'm just going to pass. And there's someone over there who looks like they might be half interested and therefore hopefully they're going to pick it up. Like it is genuinely fascinating watching that. And the minute you take the language opportunity away, I think I'm frozen, which is unfortunate. But I'm assuming you can still hear me.
I can hear. Yeah, it's good.
Oh, fine. Yeah, but then the minute then you take away the verbal and they have to then have visual connection, all of a sudden that quality goes up, flow increases, just really interesting. Anyway, I've digressed. You though use terms that we've talked about dominoes previously, but we can unpack that. But there are various terms you're using to convey an action possibility. In
Yes.
many ways, to a certain extent, you're creating language around possibilities for action, affordances,
That's it.
invitations to act, affordances, and therefore you help individuals to begin to create that sort of shared connection because they have a framework of language that they can use to sort of support each other through that. Yeah.
That's exactly it, Stu. So, for instance, a huge part of the offense is instead of in basketball us running set plays or a very scripted pattern, when we are neutral, so say we've arrived down the court and it's 5-on-5 where the defense are organized and there's no advantage anywhere. What we emphasize within the conceptual offense is getting to a trigger. And it could be any type of two-person action. So it could be a pick and roll, like a dribble handoff, maybe a three-person action involving three players where it's a screen off the ball, right? But the idea is it's all player-led. It's not me on the sideline calling it out. So the players get into these things, and then the idea is to, based on how the defense defend the trigger, we always have a way to make them wrong through acting on an affordance to punish that defense and start dominoes. So what we do is it's really simple. We would just basically create small-sided games where we have the triggers, where it's probably a short shot clock, like 4 or 5 seconds, a constrained space, and the defense must be in the defense that we're going to see. So we might constrain it. So if they're switching, which you see in any team sport, like if there's some type of screening action like lacrosse, etc., and they're switching, we would just have to constrain a defense. So how we constrain them is say, all right, you must have 2 feet outside the 3-point line when you switch so that we know the switch is aggressive, right? But then the solutions that emerge, Stu, we're watching as coaches, and then we apply our language to some of the solutions that the players are coming up with. So, and I think the key thing is we're not over constraining by saying, because this is what I'm seeing a lot, where coaches are seeing like one defense and saying if X then Y. And I don't think I think that's too much. These are more possibilities, right, Stu? So all we're doing is we're making them aware, like you said, of some of the attractive affordances within their affordance landscape as these triggers are going on. We're not saying you must do this every time because there could be so many different things. And even if a team does one type of defense the same way, well, still that it's going to be different every time because of the interacting constraints, right? So it's more about using constraints very creatively where players can explore these different solutions versus us just teaching and saying, all right, this is a reject in a pick and roll where you dribble away from the pick, go do this. It's it's about how, and this is where it gets fun because you have to be so creative using the constraints if you really want to see some of these varied solutions emerging.
Yeah, and I think the for me that's something that's so radically different. People might not see it as radically different. They might think, like you say, it's if this then that. That's the assumption people are saying. We're a design environment where if this then that. No, it's not as prescribed as that.
That's it.
It's given a certain set of circumstances, there is a place that we're going to search together that may offer this or a variation of it, and let's explore what those variations or opportunities look like
That's it,
to
Stu. I
become
think,
more
yeah,
accustomed to them.
that's it. And I think you could do this in any sport. Like we basically say to the players, whatever, obviously, yes, we have a shared idea of things that we're emphasizing and what we're looking for, and just do anything you can to create the advantage. So one of the best constraints that we found is I call it the one opportunity constraint. So, say whether it's a 2-on-2, a 3-on-3, a 4-on-4, whatever, you've basically got 6 seconds to create the advantage and get the defense in a disorganized state. If you haven't created the advantage in 7 seconds, the consequence is it's a turnover and we just stop playing. So you can imagine what that does for both sides of the ball. The defense becomes really good because they know that if they're just really applying kind of max effort for 7 seconds, they win. Whereas the offense has to become so attuned to being decisive. And that's where it's, especially with young kids, if you just put them on the court in a basketball practice, you'll see they just pass and move, they just pass, stand still. No one wants to be the decisive individual to create the advantage and go, or you just get one player who does it over and over again. So that's just a fun constraint that I use to really attune them to ways that they can create advantages in all these different situations.
You've got a really nice table um, in the book that draws out the differences between the conceptual approach, as you refer to it, and you sort of contrast it against the set play approach. So again, the
Exactly.
tradition, a more normalized approach within the world of basketball is the play, running the play. This is a construct that's, I think, really embedded in quite a lot of American sports, team
It
sports in
is.
particular, the running of the plays, and the coach designs the play, and it's the athlete's responsibility to execute the play, with the assumption being if we execute the play perfectly, we will be more successful or we will get an outcome. And then what you have to then do is do more plays, more plays, more plays. And the better you do the plays, the better you follow the pattern, the more outcomes you get. So there's loads of different ones. I'm just going to unpick a couple of them. But just speak to that notion. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a how
Oh,
prevalent is the play running construct, would you say, generally?
hugely prevalent. And the interesting thing too is its forms of life, Stu, in Europe, it's actually even more prevalent now than the NBA, the set plays,
Really?
because it's more, especially in Europe, the coach's role is seen as being more of a tactician and a controller. And it's insane, Stu. It's not uncommon for teams to have playbooks of 50 different set plays. And even what I find even more surprising is coaches change the sets they use each game based on the opponent. So instead of, for me, just doing principles and amplifying certain things up and down and making them accumulate and be even better, become even better at your principles of play, they're just changing the sets. And like you said, the sets are often done to get from A to B to C to D. Whereas for me, I still use set plays, but in far less frequency and often only on dead balls when the ball goes out of bounds. So instead of running a set like 40 times during the game, maybe it's like 10 times. But the difference is because we play conceptual most of the time, when we run the set conceptually. So that means if there's an advantage in the first part of the set, then we stop running the set and we're playing dominoes. We're not running the set like robots. And it's funny in the NBA because of all the games and the fact practices are less than Europe. That's acted as a unique constraint, and coaches are having to be more simple with their set plays. So they're still set plays, but they're a lot simpler. And it's the same problems in terms of players aren't attuned to ways to create out of it. but I think they're less heavily scripted than Europe. But I don't think that the players have clear intentions. And what I mean by that is that they're not aware of attractive affordances based on the type of defense. They're just not. So often what happens, Stu, is the set breaks down and they just go to isolation basketball one-on-one because there's nothing else on.
So, okay, so that I see that quite a bit. You can often see this, which is, within the time frame of the shot clock, there's usually some kind of a play called, and if that play doesn't go as planned, which is more often than not,
Yep.
then basically the fallback position is some kind of one-on-one play, usually by the star player, in the hope
Correct.
that they're going to basically pull something out the bag, and then obviously we get back on defense. That kind of construct is that. I think I see. That's what I think I see when I watch NBA most of
Yep.
the time.
It happens a lot, Stu. So my idea is I call it license to kill, where it's yes, you have some exceptional players in the NBA who can create advantages doing that. And if they can do it, great. But I'd prefer to put them in optimal spacings where they have more space for that solo. I call it a solo. But also, ideally, have a worse defender guarding them. So to do that, obviously, you've got to be really intentional with how you're creating that matchup advantage or the triggers you're using. So, and often if you don't have that advantage, I think it's easier to the points per possession playing out of triggers is simply it's more efficient than these solos because you're putting the defense. There's a greater chance the defense will make a mistake guarding a trigger. It's more complex. So that's where a big difference, I guess, from my principles of play is whenever we are neutral, instead of just going random I call it a random solo because that's what you often see at the wrong time in suboptimal spacing. We just re-trigger from a known spacing. So we have these spacings, especially at the pro level, which are more optimal just based on how you can space the floor and prevent one defender guarding two offensive players. So if we see neutral at any time, the players know that simply within 3 seconds, we are trying to get back into any type of two-person trigger where another player comes and boom, the idea is we're back to dominoes. So it's just relentless because say we lose the dominoes or we don't create it off the first one, well, we know seamlessly that we can flow into the next one very intentionally with the players we want kind of handling the ball, initiating versus just random kind of. Because this is funny. A lot of coaches say, move the ball, just move the ball. But that doesn't really create anything.
Yeah, because it's got no intention to it.
No intention. That's it.
The answer from the players should be what for?
That's it.
Move the ball. What for? For what intention? For what
That's
purpose?
it.
You you
Exactly.
um you talked about this idea as well about the notion of a play, but what you're saying is that you will run what you might call set plays, which is predefined movements
Yeah.
given a set of circumstances, i.e., inbounding the ball from a restart, because that you have an opportunity to do that, but you're doing it in such a way that if an opportunity or an advantage materializes halfway through the running of that play, you're taking it.
That's exactly it. And there's a great example, Stu. It's one of the videos that we put out transforming where we were running this inbound play on the sideline where the ball had gone out of bounds, and that's an opportunity you can use to run a set play. But the player inbounding the ball saw that the player in the weak side corner who wasn't even involved in the play was wide open because their player was over helping and he was standing too close to the basket. So instead of just running the very first part of the play, he took a step back and he sent a one-hand no-look pass to the player in the corner for an open three. And I stopped the practice and I said, guys, I'm delighted that this just happened. This is one of the best possessions I've seen all year because we didn't run the play because we had advantage. So it's things like that where you're constantly reinforcing it to the players, where the goal is not to run the pattern to create an advantage. And if we're going off script to do that, because we think that there's a good opportunity to create that advantage, great. And obviously that's where it becomes harder at the pro level, Stu, because guys might just go off script from the set at the wrong time, because they haven't had the chance to develop in that environment where they can actually perceive what's going on, what's emerging. But obviously, that's where I think when that happens, it's our fault as coaches because we're not putting them in the environments where they're developing that skill.
Mm. And so, I mean, it must be so great for players when
Oh, they love
they're
it.
given that opportunity, and then you can really highlight, look at what we did here. We had this,
Yeah.
but we saw that and we took it.
They love it, Stu, and it's incredible just watching them play with this approach. Whether it's pros under 14s, like some of our London Lion kids played in the youth tournament last week, and just seeing it was incredible, Stu. Like the language that they were using and what they were doing. More importantly, on the court, their skilled intentionality. It was just like a completely different. And I don't want to sound arrogant, but I wasn't coaching the team. It was the coaches who have done an amazing job at Lions, but they the kids were just doing things which you would never see in youth basketball with how they were moving, how they were interacting with each other, how they were spacing, and it was just incredible to watch.
What I like, by the way, in the book, which is I think draws this out a little bit, is you you haven't just written this theoretically. And critiqued traditional basketball coaching and presented an alternative paradigm and then left it at that. You've actually gone and given examples of the kinds of activities that you do. So just to speak to
Yeah.
one, because this is like where we get a bit practical. Jungle shooting 3-on-2. Like what's that all about?
One of my favorite ones. So it actually came about because the first time I tried this activity in Italy, I wanted some chaotic music to stress the players because I'll describe the activity in a second. And I played Welcome to the Jungle, so it just stuck. So it's a very chaotic activity. It's basically you could do it in any numerical format, and I've actually tried it during lacrosse, and I think because I did some work at Brown University applying CLA to their Division One sports, which is really interesting, and I found it works in water polo and all these invasion sports. So you got three players on offense, two players on defense, and they're playing in the same roles for 1 minute continuously. And there are two basketballs in play. So really chaotic. And the offense are constrained with where they could shoot from. So I often say you can only shoot three pointers, but you can move freely, you can drive, you can pass, you can cut, you can only shoot threes. So the defense is trying to disrupt them, steal the ball, force mistakes while the offense is trying to score. And on any shot attempt, either offense or defense could rebound, kick it out. So what you see is you get so much repetition without repetition because no shot is predetermined. So it's one of my favorite activities for shooting because the players never know really what's happening next. And they're not just shooting, but they're doing other things. They're having to perceive the defense, pass, dribble against pressure, all these things. So, and there are often two ways you can win the game, Stu. This is like a scoring system I've been trying out where the defense could win if they get 3 stops, or the offense could win if they score 5 shots. So having a way to win on defense and a way to win on offense is something I've tried just to make sure that the intentionality defensively and offensively is always there. And then obviously with jungle shooting, that's just the base version. There's so many possibilities for how you could change the constraints within it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ones you give some example constraints, which is to increase the number of players
Yeah. Yeah.
to a 4-on-3 or a 5-on-3 or a 5-on-4. Um, and what I quite like as well is that you talk about the different constraints and then you sort of give a bit of an explanation, because what you're then doing with the explanation is saying, so firstly, you describe the activity. Secondly, you talk about the kind of constraints you use. But the explanation, I think, gives the rationale, i.e.,
Yes.
why would we use this practice? Where does it sit against the framework of principles of play and conceptual offense that we're working within, which is useful, I think, for a coach to understand that this sits and is nested within that idea.
It is true. And I think too, I think I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, but I think early on when coaches are exposed to a CLA, I do think that they need some of the recipes. And that's what coaches said is like, give me the small set of games. And it's all right, I'm gonna give them to you, but with a very important caveat that you actually understand why, like you just said, some of these constraints are being used. I'm not just gonna give you a small sided game and you not know why it's designed that way and what the intentions of using it are. And that's on how a lot of coaches think. They think it's just a case of hoarding all these small-sided games and using them randomly. So the idea is, all right, you got to start with the recipes, because if you're moving over from a drill-based approach, it actually takes a lot of comfort just to get used to using small-sided games in terms of how you explain it, how you coach the players within it, and how you observe it, right? And the idea now is that as you're getting used to those things, now we want to move towards you actually coming up with your own ways to change the game. So identify your own constraints, play around with it. Then maybe you start actually inventing your own small set of games. But I think it's very rare that a coach would just go from dominant approach to that straight away. I think that middle ground is just getting familiar with small-sided games, but as quickly as possible, having a more reflective consideration as to why the activities are constrained in the way they are.
Yeah, that's nice. It's really nice. I also really like you've done a funnel of variability, but you call it the representative dial, where you've articulated different practice forms and where they are on a continuum of least representative to most representative. I have to say, by the way, I love your creativity when it comes to creating names and identities for things. For example,
Thank you.
one of your least representative activities is called mosquito shooting. What's that?
So it's actually the origins of it are quite funny. So I was coaching in Italy for 3 years, and that was where I first understood what CLA was, Stu. And every year I took a big step forward, kind of learning, applying it. And it was in northern Italy, in the regions where they have all the rice fields to grow the rice for the risotto. So you can imagine the mosquitoes there were ridiculous. So every practice, it was insane. Sometimes we'd run a team practice inside in the afternoon, and there'd just be mosquitoes buzzing around. So I just made a joke of it once where it was like a lower stress practice day. It was midweek with my guys, and it was a lower stress day. So I wanted to have a variable shooting game that wasn't like crazy intense like jungle shooting. So I was like, all right, guys, we're gonna pull this mosquito shooting, and the job of the defender was to be as annoying as possible to distract the shooter as much as possible without being live and not being allowed to block the shot. Right, that's like the base version. So you're gonna pass from all these different places, and you've got to contest in all these weird ways. You can block their eyes, you can give them a little push, do all these things to basically perturb the shooter. So it just became a really fun, low stress practice activity. And then there's all sorts of constraint. You can do it live, of course, where they're actually trying to block the shot. That would be very important because, obviously in a more representative shooting activity, the shooter has to have that threat of having the shot blocked. But we just found it was a really fun, low stress one. It was great for pre-game, all this stuff.
Love that. It's a great analogy, being a mosquito. Just being really annoying and buzzing around people
And
and
it resonates with
distracting them.
kids. So it's like, especially
Yeah,
young kids, it's how you get them doing CLA without, because a constraint really doesn't mean much to them. So if you make it fun and you dress it up, it really changes how they're participating in it.
I love it. I love it. Um, I mean, look, this is just honestly, I mean, like, even just through this conversation, you've unpacked some things that I've seen. I mean, there's so much in here. Like, I mean, it, it, there's a part of me that's almost like I'm in awe of like the like I knew you're writing it. Like I knew it'd be good, but yeah. Um,
Very kind.
I'm not ever going to write a book now. You know that. You've set the bar so high, right, that I'm just not going to, because then everything will pale into sort of insignificant in comparison. Um, so I throughout the book there's QR codes, there's resources that people can access. You're putting a lot of this content out there into the kind of the sort of social media space as well for people to interest. I know you're very much encouraging and you're running activity like camps and things for coaches to come and learn more about this and all those sorts of things. So what's the best way for people to, get connect up and find out more, and where can they get the book, more importantly?
Oh, thanks so much, Drew. So I'd just say shoot me a message on our social media. It's just transforming b-ball on Twitter and Instagram. We've got a website, transformingball.com. We've got a bunch of free activities, which I wanted to put out because I didn't want there to be a barrier to entry for coaches all over in basketball to learn about this. The book is just on Amazon, so whatever kind of country you're in, you can just search Transforming Basketball, the book, and it will come up. And yeah, please do reach out. I love just having conversations with other practitioners in this space. I always want to learn and get better, Stu, and I think that's one of the key parts of transforming. It's never a finished product. We're always learning from everyone in this field so that we can continue to grow, develop. So yeah, I'm just always interested in genuine conversations just to advance the coaching profession.
Amazing. And you mentioned before we recorded that there's plans for a part 2.
There is, Stu, and that'll be hopefully with your contribution. If I can convince you to do it, Lara, it'll be amazing. I know we discussed obviously what to talk about, but yeah, it would be a really interesting one because it's more, I'd say it's more practical, Stu. So I actually had a bunch which I had to take out, which was like I had a whole chapter on working with beginners, which I had to take out of the first one. Shooting, that's always one I get a lot of pushback from, using feedback ecologically. And I actually had a chapter on department methodology. So it will be a really interesting one because I've got all those chapters, and it's because I've explained the theory, it will be more practical. And of course, we'll have contributions from, people like yourselves, everyone, like other industry leaders who have had a big influence, inspiration on me. So yeah, I'm actually more excited for the second one because of that. I feel like it's more authentically my own, if that makes sense.
Wow. Well, I mean, if they talk about a difficult second album, I mean, it feels to me like you've set the bar so high with this one that it will be the most difficult of difficult second albums or second books. But anyway, no, I mean, hats off. This is a great addition to the the literature, I think, for those of us who are engaged in nonlinear pedagogy, ecological dynamics and its theoretical frameworks, and then the applications thereof, and then utilizing constraints-led approach in this way. I think there's so much in there, and I've come away with a whole series of really good ideas just to sort of embed into my own practice. So like I said, it does have lots of applicability to anybody working in various different contexts, in different ways. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing it with me. I appreciate the fact you've written it. It's getting increasingly moth-eared as I pick through and fold down. I'm really bad because you're not supposed to do that because it's like you're being disrespectful to the author. But I think in this case, with this book, you want it to be used. I wanted it to be used.
Yeah, exactly. No, Stu, thanks for everything you do and the impact you've had on me. It's funny. I think I've come a long way and I've still got a lot I need to learn. But I think it was only 6 years ago I asked you because I couldn't understand how you could develop the jump shot in basketball without using drills and form shooting when we were in Stanford in England. So thanks for everything you do and everyone else in the Skill Act community, and really excited just to keep learning from everyone in this space.
Awesome. Well, like I said, appreciate it. I'm looking forward to wherever you set up your next department of methodology. It'll be interesting to see where you land. And in the meantime, all the best, and look forward to chatting again in the near future.
Thanks so much, Stu.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.